reserve asset of the reserveless asset system. In other words, what is the reserve asset of the eurodollar? My argument is, and this is taking my argument, which is channeling Brent Johnson's argument, is that, well, it's nothing. It's a fiction of imagination. It's like an imaginary number from math, like the square root of -9. Here's what I mean by this. This is going to get a little weird, so bear with me. If you're familiar with accounting, you know that companies have a balance sheet. And on the balance sheet, there's two sides. There's the left-hand side and the right-hand side. The left-hand side of the balance sheet is typically called the debit side of the balance sheet, and the right-hand side of the balance sheet is typically called the credit side of the balance sheet. Why is this important? Well, one of the nuances, Josh, in this is that the left-hand side, the debit side of the balance sheet, the default balance of a debit side account is, you might have guessed, a debit. Just like the default balance on a credit, just like the default balance of a account on the credit side of the balance sheet would be expressed as a credit. So let me say that in English. If you want to increase an account on the debit side of the balance sheet, you would actually debit it, because debiting it makes the base of the account go up. And if you want to make it go down, you would credit it. It's the exact opposite for the right-hand side of the balance sheet. If you want to make that account go up, you would credit it, and to make it go down, you would then debit it. A good way to remember this, or at least a good way to remember this, is think about it from the bank's perspective. If you're talking to a bank, the bank will credit your checking account with them for, let's say, $100 if you deposit $100. And if you spend $50, on your debit card, they will then debit $50 from your account. That's the word that the bank, that's the term of art that the banks will use. Why is this the case? Because from the bank's perspective, your checking account with them is a liability. A liability lives on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Therefore, when the liability goes up, you credit it. And to make it go down, you debit it. And this is all going to come back to the eurodollar system, I promise. I know it's boring as hell, but it's really important to get this framework down here. So in order to do a journal entry or a transaction, you must be in balance. In other words, all your debits have to add up to all your credits.
At least if you are a non-bank entity. Me and Justin cannot have an unequilibrium balance sheet. The banks, they can do that through some sort of financial engineering. Justin, continue.
Yeah. So Josh. Well, so let me put some more meat on that bone there. So just because all transactions have to have a debit and a credit, or multiple debits and multiple credits, you want to get cute, it doesn't necessarily mean that all transactions have to touch both sides of the balance sheet. Here's an easy example. Suppose you have $100,000 in a checking account. You want to buy a $30,000 car in cash. You take $30,000, you give it to the dealer. Now you've got a $30,000 car. So from your perspective, your balance sheet would credit cash by $30,000 to bring it down, and then you would debit new car for $30,000, suggesting that you bought this new car, it's worth $30,000. I mean, forget depreciation, all that nonsense when you drive off the lot. But the point is that even though you have done a debit and a credit, you've stayed exclusively on the left-hand side of the balance sheet. You've just taken, $30,000 of your $100,000 from your shoebox of cash and moved it to the shoebox of a car. Very, very simple to understand that. So that would be, think of it as like a lateral move in the balance sheet versus a horizontal move in the balance sheet. But the other thing to note is that even though you stayed on one side of the balance sheet, you are still doing the nature of your balance sheet hasn't changed. In other words, one side hasn't grown to eclipse the other side, even though you've stayed on one side. Okay, so going back to the eurodollar system, what is the actual asset of the eurodollar, or the actual reserve asset of the eurodollar system? Suppose you're in God mode for a second, and in this God mode, you can look at all of the balance sheets in aggregate of all the banks in the eurodollar system. If these eurodollar banks decide to extend, just numbers on my backside here, $1 billion worth of credit, so in other words, they're going to extend 1 billion IOU dollars from their various individual balance sheets, but they're going to grow the money supply in this case, M2, by $1 billion. The question then becomes, well, what's the corresponding offset you have to do for that? So let me speak in accounting jargon for a second. There'll be a credit to liability accounts of $1 billion. Those liability accounts are the various checking accounts, savings accounts, spendable money accounts, whatever, of the people in the euro dollar banking system. So you've got $1 billion credit. What do you debit for $1 billion? And this is where many people would say, okay, well, whatever you're debiting is the asset. So for example, let's say you're making a loan. You might debit, it would be a good example. You might debit, let's say, aircraft leases. You might debit oil well leases. You might debit, gold on reserve. And this would actually live on the left-hand side of the balance sheet. And so in this case, even though my screen's backwards here, so bear with me. Even though you've increased the right-hand side of the balance sheet, the credit side, by expanding the liabilities, you also, in my example, putting in collateral, would also increase the left-hand side of the balance sheet by roughly the same amount in order to keep things in balance. But that's not what happens, because that doesn't necessarily need to happen. And this is where it gets back into the accounting fiction. And so this is I haven't thought this through, but this is kind of where my thinking's going along these lines. To complete and make your transaction balance, you don't actually have to debit an account on the left hand, on the left hand side of the balance sheet. You could theoretically debit a contra asset account, a contra liability account on the right hand side of the balance sheet. And what I'm trying to say in English is think of it as like you create like an anti-liability account. And the reason you're creating an anti-liability account is you're basically ramming the transaction through onto the balance sheet. And when I say ramming the transactions through, what I mean is you've got to have something to offset this $1 billion of bank liabilities you created. And if you create an anti-liability at the same time, it's utter hogwash. But it would create and it would force the transaction to balance. Now, what's going on in this situation is that you're dealing exclusively with the right-hand side, with the credit side of the balance sheet when you do this, and you're expanding it. That is to say, you're growing it in the sense that you've got this anti-liability and this liability you're creating at the same time, but you don't really have any assets or anything in the real or on the debit side of the balance sheet to offset it. Very, very big picture. One can also make an argument that the left-hand side, the debit side of the balance sheet, deals with real-world things, collateral, cash in the bank, stuff that occurs in the real world. While the right-hand side of the balance sheet, that's the liability side, owner's equity side, etc., that deals with more of the intangible, more of the imaginary things when it comes to the world of finance. Both are, of course, important, but likewise, you also want to make certain there's a link between these two worlds, because if the link gets severed, then you've got a problem. And this takes us back to the entire point of this video, asking what is the reserve asset of the eurodollar system. My comment is that as long as people are willing to accept the fiction of creating this anti-liability or a contra-liability account to offset, to provide the corresponding debit to the credit for the eurodollar system expanding, then the system can expand, but it's based upon an accounting fiction. And if something should happen where faith in this, maybe faith's not the right way of saying it. If something should happen where people start to question the mechanism of this and say, well, wait a minute, you have all these dollars here, that are owed, and there's nothing there that's supporting it because there's this anti-liability, these contra liabilities. Justin, you're talking nonsense, garbage. That's where you start running, and I think, into problems, because all of a sudden people start demanding the real collateral. And getting back to the original point of this video, well, there's no real collateral in the system. Why is there no real collateral in the system? I would argue there's no real collateral in the system because people were willing, and when I say people, I mean financial institutions, big players, maybe some individuals, but again, this is probably more higher on the scale in terms of sophistication. They were willing to accept these IOUs. Now, from the perspective of a bank's balance sheet within the system, there would definitely be a journal entry that would touch the other side of their balance sheet. But my argument is that if you take all the balance sheets together, go into God mode and aggregate it and make a philosophical argument of what's really going on here, if there's no asset on the left-hand side of the depth of the balance sheet that's being created or being reserved or being escrowed, whatever, and I don't think there is, then the only way that you can balance that transaction is you have to have an anti-liability or a contra-liability account, because that would work. That account could theoretically take the debit into itself. And the reason it's called a contra in this particular situation is that on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, remember, the default balance is a credit, but if you debit an account that starts at 0, you're sending it into the negative, which is the point of the contra thing. One last thing, if you want to know where contra accounts actually are used in real life, imagine, let's say you're like Costco, you sell $100 million worth of product in a quarter. Of that $100 million you sell, you have it on very good authority that, let's just say, 3% is going to be returned. So when you report to your shareholders, you say we had $100 million of sales this quarter, but of that $100 million, even though it hasn't occurred, we have reason to believe that it will occur, 3% will come back. So we're going to create a contra income account by $3 million. So the net income we report in this example would be $97 million, $100 million minus the $3 million, even though they actually got $100 million and they have not yet gotten the returns in. That's ideally, and how you would use this, or that's why this or that's probably a clean example of why you would have a contra account on either side of the balance sheet. But in any event, it's a far cry from, let's say, a large retailer using a contra account on the debit side to impair and note, let's say, what might come in terms of returns, so therefore the revenue is going to go down, versus using something on the credit side of the balance sheet to essentially, I don't want to say print money, that's not the right way of saying it, but to issue tissue liabilities without having to do any real assets, or without having to back it up by any real assets. That I don't think is the correct use of the function.
That was quite a monologue. I thought that you
Yeah,
were
sorry,
speaking
Josh.
in 2x speed about philosophical accounting, and That is going to go over a lot of heads.
Yeah, this video, like if you don't understand this, like don't feel bad. I mean, and if you want to know more about it, just start with the very basics. Understand how the balance sheet works, and to start understanding how the balance sheet works, understand that the left hand and the right hand side, the left hand side of the balance sheet, debit side of the balance sheet, the default balance on accounts there is debit, deals with real world stuff. Right hand side is the credit side, deals with liabilities, owner equity, and is more so of the imaginary part of the balance sheet, or intangible. That's better saying, intangible part of the balance sheet.
So bringing this back to the euro dollar, I think what Justin was saying is what is the reserve asset of the world? Because dollars right now are what is transacted by far the most in the euro dollar system. And what is actually backing that? There is always or usually something on the other side of that transaction. But in reality, all of the things that they're transaction with are fake. None of it is real. It is all
Yeah,
printed by a different organization, or that organization is a bank in most cases. So the reserve asset is not a tangible aspect like gold or oil or copper. It is just the confidence that what the other person is transacting in will be good in the future.
Josh, to put just some more meat on that, what I would say is what people transact as dollars, they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a dollar. Have you ever heard the question, if a horse has four legs and a tail and you call the tail a leg, how many legs does a horse have? Well, it's either going to be four or five, depending upon your point of view. And if you say it's five because you're calling the tail a leg, well, that might be the case. But if the horse tries to sit on its tail, it's going to fall on its ass. So it's kind of one of those things. I mean, even tether's a good example of this. We have a dollar approximation. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of the problem, is that people along the way, they forgot the importance of understanding what the real thing is. In this case, a dollar versus a dollar approximation. They're viewed as being one and the same, and no, they're not. And I will also go a step further and say, although we'd say this for another video to go into detail here, but like it probably makes sense, and it's probably good for the economy in general to have the abilities to do approximations of things like that. Actually, I think there's a very good function for that. But in order to have this work in a way that's meaningful and makes sense for all of us, you have to not only be able to prove assets, which is relatively easy, you also have to be able to prove the liabilities, like these IOUs that are being issued. I think that we should issue IOUs. I think the economy does better for issuing IOUs. I don't think it makes sense to operate on a full reserve standard, although I do think you should have full reserve banks for those who wish to choose to bank with them. I'm not trying to say, don't do that. But having a way to manage and having a way to clearly understand where there's no asymmetrical information advantage of the liabilities that have been issued, that's what we're missing. And and the current system we have, it's
It's a
well,
lack
anyways,
of
never a video.
transparency.
Yeah.
Right now, there is too many unknowns that are even on the bank's balance sheet that they don't know what's going on. We need a much more transparent system that it still has the anonymous aspect to it.
Yeah.
Justin, I have to run, so we are going to end this one here. If you guys need to, I would recommend watching this in probably zero point 0.5 speed, as
Was I talking that fast?
Justin, I have been knowing you for a very long time. That could
So
have been
you're
the
basically used to
fastest.
the abuse. You're
That
used to
that
the
could have been
abuse.
the fastest I've ever heard you talk in my entire life for a good 10-minute segment. So I gotta fly. Goodbye.
Take care.